Hello, everyone. Hello, Festival of Curiosity. You're very welcome to this Science Gallery Rapid Residency conversation catch-up. My name is Ian Martin. I'm the lead mediator at Science Gallery Dublin, and I'm going to be your moderator for this discussion today. So I hope you're at home now and you might have a cup of tea beside you and you're up for it, really curious about what we're up to in Science Gallery. And one of the things we are up to at Science Gallery is the Rapid Residency Programme. What is the Rapid Residency Programme? Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has meant that has caused so much disruption and turned our world upside down, including the creative community. All over the world and in Ireland, artists, innovators, designers have seen their opportunities slow down. Gigs, exhibitions and other events have moved online. Science Gallery wanted to support and collaborate with our community. And with that in mind, we launched a round of experimental grants, virtual residencies available for makers, creators, writers, artists, and designers in Ireland. Initially, we had 5 grants to develop an idea over a 5-week period. And the response was overwhelming. We actually received 200 applications, and as a result of the rich variety and creativity shown, the Provost's Academic Development Fund from Trinity College Dublin offered additional funding to triple the number of residencies, which was absolutely fantastic. So over the last 10 weeks or so, 18 artists have been paired with 2 advisors selected depending on their areas of interest. Our advisors have come from experts from Science Gallery Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, and other support and cultural partners. By the end of the Rapid Residency, the Artist Rapid Residency, the idea is that maybe they would have, or the idea is to produce published work, or produce full published work that might be able to further produce some published work or develop their idea further in the future. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists for today. First up, I want to introduce Beulah Azugo and Giselle Natumba. Beulah and Giselle are an emerging artist duo whose projects explore using online and open source platforms to document the experience of Black communities in Ireland over the past 30 years. Beulah is also a mediator in Science Gallery Dublin, just like myself. So, hi Beulah. And their Rapid Residency advisor, we're absolutely delighted to have here today, is Aideen McCall. Aideen is a curator and a culture producer with a background in design. Aideen has worked with organisations such as the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Irish Architecture Foundation. She currently works as a development and advocacy manager at the ARC, while also managing the 100 Archive, a platform for contemporary Irish design. Thanks so much for coming here today. And we also have with us today is our second Rapid Residency artist, Owen Boss. Owen is a visual artist and co-founder and co-artistic director of Anu Productions, founded in 2009. Actually founded it with Louise Lowe. Anu is a multidisciplinary company cross-pollinating theatre, visual art and dance. Owen's project is centred around an experimental artwork that will explore the part of the brain involved with spoken word and comprehension. And Owen's advisors from Trinity are Mark Cunningham. Mark Cunningham is a professor in neurophysiology of epilepsy at Trinity College Dublin. Epilepsy is a neurological disorder where brain activities goes awry, causing seizures, which can manifest in several ways, including the classic and well-known convulsive type seizures. Mark's research has been supported by a variety of different groups, including Science Foundation Ireland, the Royal Society. Owen, another advisor for Owen, is Caroline Jago. Dr. Caroline Jago is Assistant Professor of Clinical Speech Language Studies at Trinity College Dublin. Caroline's background is in speech and language therapy, where her work has focused on adults with aphasia, communication disability, which commonly follows stroke, and progressive aphasia. Caroline is the lead of the Dublin Conversation Partner Scheme for Aphasia. Her research addresses inclusion from a micro focus on participation of people with communication disability in conversations, to work on cultural linguistic inclusion in speech and language therapy interventions, extending to macro focus on disability inclusion in humanitarian settings. Oh my God, what a panel to be here today. So thanks so much. So we might start off with Aideen and Beulah. So welcome, guys. So if you could maybe, just unmute your mic there. Brilliant. So thanks so much for coming here today. Beulah, I might start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about your project and maybe where the idea came from?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yeah. So like you said, we are looking at ways to sort of source, preserve, and contextualize the experiences of our diaspora, which is the Black or African diaspora here in Ireland. And we're sort of looking at the most, I guess, like the most fun or spontaneous way to do that. Where the project came from, it sort of came from looking at other or engaging with other cultural archives. So mainly the Black Cultural Archives, which is in the UK, that was founded in the 1990s. But one of the main things that we got from looking at that archive is how we can sort of, or how diasporas can sort of engage retelling experiences. So I guess the normal or the traditional institutional sort of gatekeep a lot of the time. So much of the material in them that might pertain to certain marginalized cultural groups, like Black people, might have gotten there or might be there by people who weren't part of those groups. A lot of the time they were, I think traditionally traditionally a lot of archival material or say museum material was taken violently. And I guess sort of being able to create your own cultural repositories is a way, I guess, supporting that and being able to center your own retellings of your own histories. As well as that, the idea maybe came from our own work within our communities. So personally, I do organizing with Merge, and in doing that, we're able to see community building and we're able to see sort of political strategizing. And I think through that, we kind of had conversations within Merge about how archiving or preserving all the things that we do can be an organizational tool, because we can then pass on those community building tactics to other people. So I think it's those two things that make us sort of think of, you know, what is our diaspora? Like, what does that look like when we sort of gather everything that we build outside of our homes here? And, you know, how can we gather them and build them and put them in, or sort of reposit them in a place that's, in a way that's completely accessible?
That sounds brilliant. I was going to ask actually, like, how did the two of you meet? I know from a story I chatted to you previously that Reggie Snow was a Reggie Snow concert came about or something like that.
Yeah. So we actually met online on Twitter. I think that we both wanted to go to Reggie Snow, and I think I tweeted, "Is anyone going to Reggie Snow, or like would someone like to go with me?" And Giselle was the only person who said yes.
Oh, amazing!
So yeah, we ended up going to that, and we've been friends since. We have pretty similar interests, I would say.
Brilliant. I was Aideen, are you a Reggie Snow fan as well, or?
I am actually. I don't know if it was the same one, but I did go to see Reggie Snow in the Olympia was it a year and a half ago?
Oh, we saw him in the Academy, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It would be great if it was the same one.
Yeah, it was meant to be. It was meant to be. It was meant to be.
The Venn diagram of archiving and Irish hip hop.
Yeah, coming together. I love it. So, how do you intend? So maybe I can open up to Giselle as well. Like, how do you intend to create your digital archive or your digital your digital archive that contextualizes experience of Black communities in Ireland?
We intend to source and collect materials and documents, such as photographs, audiovisuals, and written documents, by engaging with the community and making it open to the community to contribute their experiences. We intend to engage with different organizations and individuals within our community that are able to shed light on their experiences. Yeah.
I think that also another aspect of how we're planning to collect material as well is that we're sort of looking at what it would look like if you could import, like a different cultural framework onto the cultural framework we have now. So I know that in an African sense, the way that we passed on stories or we passed on history was orally or through story or through conversation or through song. So I think that sort of influenced how we started collecting things because we basically just started talking to people. We started linking in with people who were of different generations than us and just meeting people for coffee and being like, well, when did you come to Ireland? What was your experience like as a migrant? What did that look like for you? What's home to you? What languages do you speak? And just being able to have those conversations and sort of like, I guess, practice. I guess that in itself was sort of an archival practice to be able to sit and sort of collect statements and store them. So I think that's where the idea came from, to be able to maybe reach out and create networks and just create conversation and make a link, have people to be able to come to us and say, we have this that can be reposited, or we have this sort of experience that we would like you to have and contextualize for us and store.
So you can just listen to their stories and reframe them and Yeah,
not necessarily have us be the ones who reframe them, but have them be the ones who reframe them. For example,
Perfect.
Giselle, you were saying that we also created links with organisations as well. One of the last organisations we've been talking to is Black Pride Ireland. So some of their work they've given to us to reposit. Some of that comes in the form of posters for like Pride events. Some of that is speech text. Some of that is audio, like chanting as well. So it's that sort of thing where we're not the ones who are categorizing or maybe describing their work. They're the ones who are doing it, and we are just kind of being the conduit, or being, I suppose, we're curating it. We're just holding it and we're preserving it for them. So I suppose it's giving other people the space to, archive their own work rather than have us do it.
Brilliant. I might bring in Aideen there about maybe how did you help out Giselle and Beulah in their project, and specifically maybe you could give us a little insight about your 100 Archive project and what it is and how maybe that tied in. I'm actually really curious about it myself. My sister's a graphic designer and heard about it, so she was absolutely I want to hear everything.
Cool. So the 100 Archive has started from a different type of starting point, but I was matched up with Giselle and Beulah in the hopes that some of our practice might be useful for them to hear about, be it to mimic or adapt or steer clear of, depending on their own research and the other avenues they've gone down and so on. So the 100 Archive is a platform for contemporary design in Ireland with a focus on graphic and communication design, because the designers and studios who originally set it up in 2012 work in that field. We operate a little bit in the real world, but primarily online. And the core of our activity is to have an open call every year for designers all over Ireland and Irish designers overseas to submit their recent work for consideration. That goes through a 2-stage assessment process, and then out of that we create a selection of 100 archive-worthy recent design projects, hence the name 100 Archive. And the intention for that is to create a record of design practice in Ireland and the impact designers overseas have, the impact Irish designers overseas have, to kind of show you what happens in design in Ireland, the breadth of it, the variety of it, the quality of it, show you the size of the industry. It's bigger than you think it is. There's more going on and more people employed in it than you might think, and to show the huge impact that design has. Design, it completely surrounds us. It affects and impacts us all the time in small ways and often in big ways too. So it's about kind of being able to get that across through the selections that we make and through the additional activities that we do. And I guess we got together a little while ago, the three of us, to discuss that. For me to hear a small bit about what Beulah and Giselle were doing, and for me to kind of fill them in on what we do and how we do it, and the sort of the elements of, I guess, the online platform that enable us to pull submissions in from designers all over. So it's not just a sort of a top-down, we decide what's interesting, we go after it and we collect it, but rather the design community gives it to us. We sometimes have to poke and prod to get the stuff that we want, or to get a broader selection. But generally speaking, it's set up so that the design community comes to us and brings us what they have. And online is good in that respect, and it's good in terms of making something big and broad and accessible by anyone for anything, whether it's you're a practicing designer and you want to see what's happening, you're studying, you're researching, or you're simply culturally curious and find design an interesting lens through which to look at the world. But I guess one of the other things that we discussed that was kind of, it's the bit that we fall short on in the 100 Archive. So archives are about collecting things that matter, creating a record, making those accessible so that people of all sorts can use them, learn from them, whatever materials you have. The bit that's really important to archiving that we don't really do is proper preservation. So we put it all on a website, but a website is not preservation. The web moves fast, it forgets quickly. Digital materials can degrade very easily. The digital materials we have are dependent on the platform's software and hardware we have to view it. They change and develop and quickly become obsolete. So depending on all of that, you may or may not be able to access your material in the first place. And that can become more difficult as time passes. So the world of digital preservation is really difficult. Like preserving paper is actually so much easier. And objects and, stuff that you can hold. If you can hold it, it's a little bit easier to hold on to. Compared to the digital world. So that's one of the things we talked about, the kind of the challenge.
That is mind-blowing. Sorry, I'm like never, oh my God. I'm sure people that are watching this at home are like, oh my God too.
Yeah, and like that's the thing is we think it's easy, right? And we think it's the ideal way to hold on to stuff. Digitize your collections, hold on to your photographs digitally, don't print them off because they could, your house could go on fire and then your photographs are gone, things like that. But actually the digital world is really precarious. So it's a really challenging area, and one that the 100 Archive, with the exception of a partnership with the National Library of Ireland and the National Web Archive, some of the websites that we select are preserved through that. But apart from that, we are not yet preserving anything. So we're hitting some of the marks in terms of being an archive, and then in others we're really being quite cheeky by calling ourselves one, which we fully admit to.
Hands up. Yeah, brilliant. That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. I was going to ask a question to Giselle, actually. I remember we were having a chat on Instagram about you're noticing any common themes or trends in the archive that you've developed so far. I can actually pull up a photograph. I remember we were talking about some of the protests that were outside the Dáil. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about them. I'm going to share my screen now for a second.
So we noticed a common theme in the materials that have been documented. We've noticed a common theme in the materials that have been submitted to the archive, and that is that a lot of the materials have been politically influenced. And I think that is because people's life at the time really centered political and grassroots movements. As you can see, there has been a lot of anti-deportation movements, especially in 2005 and 2006. And those are the years those two photos were taken. And the deportation protests were in opposition to the increase of deportation orders being served to people, we could argue unjustly. And so from the materials submitted, we could see that the deportation really affected people's lives and really threatened their quality of life in Ireland. And yeah.
Well, I remember with our last conversation, it's stuff that really kind of like when you see these photographs, it really moves you. And it's kind of like, somebody I say this kind of it's kind of deeply affects you too. I was going to ask Beulah, one of the things that could you tell us a little about explain what Copyleft is and why maybe it's a critical tool for documenting marginalised communities in Ireland?
So Copyleft is a way of licensing things. It kind of allows people to freely distribute your art or your photography or whatever it is, non-commercially. So instead of maybe having something be copyrighted and you having to seek a license or pay a certain amount of money to access it or use it or reuse it, it's basically free. So earlier we kind of talked about how archival gatekeeping sort of gets in the way of people accessing archives a lot of the time. I think there's a lot of problems with accessing archives in an institution. First of all, a lot of the time, the way things are categorized might not necessarily be right, or it might not necessarily be, it might distort whatever is being stored. So for example, say if I went to a big institutional archive and I was looking to access something about my own culture, and maybe the word that I have for it in the language that I use might not be the same word that it's categorized under, and I might not be able to find it. But say I do find it, I might not be able to license it. I might not be able to use it forever for whatever maybe educational or artistic purposes that I want to use it for, which means that, like Adrian was saying, when things are online, they're so much easier to share. But a lot of the time, things that are digitized are still not necessarily free or easy to use. So something that we wanted to do was sort of make sure that whatever we were archiving was free to use, non-commercial, but also it kind of helped us in sourcing material as well, because I think one example that we might have is we were looking at bigger archives to sort of look at what history looked like for maybe Black people here. And say, for example, the RTE archives, we could access them because they're online and they're free, but we couldn't really reproduce the materials that they had. So what we wanted to do was sort of maybe reimagine that and maybe create a repository and create a space where materials were free to access. And we're also easy to, not only free to access, but also free to sort of be able to
explore or...
Yeah, to explore as well. I think we also wanted to be able to maybe empower people to do that work themselves. Like we were saying earlier, we're sort of acting as conduits or maybe curators of the archive, but we wanted it to be kind of really dynamic exchange of materials and exchange of information. We're also really inspired by the open knowledge movement as well, which is things like Wikipedia. It's a way to freely use and redistribute knowledge without any legal or social or technological difficulty as well. So I think that's why we prioritized it in our archive. I'm not sure that it's... Sorry?
No, go on.
I'm not sure that it's widely applicable, AD, and I'm sure you could kind of tell us about how you license things as well, and maybe...
Well, I guess licensing is something that we haven't really grappled with in the 100 archive. When people submit their work, they are asked to do so sort of on behalf of a number of people who make the work. So, someone designs a poster for a cultural organization. There could be a number of designers involved in the design of that. There could be other collaborators, a photographer, an illustrator, a copywriter. There is a client, and someone submits that work, and we ask them to confirm that they have the consent of everyone involved to submit the work. They are essentially submitting the work to a publishing platform. So they're doing so knowing that it is available on our site, could be pulled and sent elsewhere, republished somewhere else. But that's kind of the understanding that we try and give to those who submit their work. The additional layer of that is if a website goes to the National Library and to the National Web Archive, there's an additional, the library gets in touch and says, this is what we're planning to do. We're planning to properly capture and preserve your website. Is that all right with the owner of the website, which could be the designer, it could be the client, or something like that. And that's a sort of an additional layer. But further to that, in terms of licensing or, pulling our materials to put it elsewhere, it's something we haven't really interrogated too much, to be honest. I guess to date, we have been largely visited by the design community plus. So, clients or potential clients, people in design education and design research and so on. And we haven't yet hit the point where we have to kind of go, okay, like, would someone want to license this stuff, and can they, and how could they, and should they, and how do we navigate that? So it's something still for us to be figured out.
Yeah, one of the things about like figuring out stuff, it sounds like has everyone? It seems like both your Beulah and Giselle, you've learned so much from this project. Maybe you could tell us a little about that. I know Aideen, then maybe you could tell us about maybe some of the maybe you've learned from being an advisor as well. Like, so I might open that up to everyone to maybe chip in.
I would definitely say that throughout the residency, something that I have really liked is that sort of creating networks and sharing knowledge. Because I know when myself and Giselle started this, we were sort of, we were calling ourselves like DIY archivists. We were kind of just looking for information online and we're just learning as we go. So it was really, really nice to actually be able to connect with people and learn about things that we hadn't even thought about, or learn about things that we didn't even thought of thinking about. I know Aideen was really helpful in terms of the conversation that we had about preserving and archiving and collecting being one thing, and then preserving being a whole other aspect to grapple with. So I think that's one thing I really, really took away, or one of the best things I took away to sort of look into more.
And I guess from my perspective, in terms of my learnings, it's simply been really fantastic to learn that this project exists, and we're due to catch up again, I think, next month, and it's going to be really exciting to see where the project is then and see it continue to grow and evolve. And another thing that's been surprising for me but really heartening is that, as described or as explained, the 100 Archive, like, we're not proper trained archivists. It was set up by designers. I come from a curating background, but not collections management, not that side of things. So we've had a lot to learn. We clearly still have a lot to learn, but there was something really, really heartening about the fact that there were things that we were doing that could be translated or, of use to something that on the face of it is quite different, but at its core is actually kind of similar. It's about harnessing the materials that lots of people have, creating a conduit for it, and then, finding a way to enable people to really explore and interact. And apparently you can do that for design, and you can do that for Black communities, and you could probably do it for a ton of other things as well, which is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. Right. And Giselle, do you have anything that you've really enjoyed during this residency, or anything you've learned maybe that you want to add? Just your mic.
As Beulah said, really
I really enjoyed making new networks and communicating with different people and learning about other people's stories and their experiences, and also just finding new information that wasn't available to us. Yeah, that was very
Rewarding. Brilliant. That's fantastic. I might just end it there, folks. I think that really gives a really good snapshot of the residency so far. So I just want to say thanks so much for joining us today. And I might ask our next interviewers or interviewees to get ready. Fabulous. We're all there. Thanks so much for joining us here today. I might start off with yourself there, Owen. I remember, could you tell us about maybe where your project came about? I think it was events in 2014.
Yeah, in 2014, my wife had to go into hospital to have emergency surgery to remove a brain tumor. She came through the surgery pretty well, but there was complications, and she ended up being in hospital for about a month or two afterwards. She had to be induced into a coma, so it was a pretty traumatic event that she went through and the family went through. And then post-surgery, she was fine for about a year, but then after that, she started to have seizures due to the surgery that had happened the kind of year beforehand, I suppose. And she's had a seizure about once a month ever since. And it manifests itself through language. So she wouldn't have a convulsive seizure, which would be kind of what people may think of as epilepsy, I suppose. So it's based around language and how she communicates. So when she's having a seizure, she can't understand what people are saying, and when she speaks herself, she speaks in, I suppose, kind of gobbledygook.
That it sounds like such a traumatic experience for your wife, and also it's obviously been a very traumatic experience for your family in general. Why is right now kind of a right point to kind of explore your project?
Yeah, it's been hugely traumatic for the family and for my wife. But it's kind of, I suppose, 6 years now, and it started to manifest and percolate in my kind of creative consciousness or something, over the last couple of years, and wouldn't leave me. So when something like that happens and I keep thinking about it, or keep thinking about creative ways of engaging with something that's happened in my life, then I kind of start to listen to that and start to try and find a path through. So I'd say I've been thinking about it for maybe 2 or 3 years, and just let it kind of percolate in the back of my head, and maybe think of ways of how I could kind of navigate a path through it and navigate some sort of creative response to it. And I suppose in fundamental terms, I just want to try and understand what's happening and to gain more knowledge around what it is that's happening when these seizures take part. And it's had such an influence and consequence for our life that it's just there kind of all the time, I suppose.
Maybe we might go into what is actually happening inside the head. I actually have you passed on some images of your wife's tumor or the scan. I can share my screen now and bring it up maybe, and we can have a chat through it.
So on the left is an MRI scan of my wife's head, and on the left-hand side of that scan, you can see the grey area, the kind of grey circular space in the bottom right of the skull. So that would be the tumour pre-operation. And then on the right-hand side, you can see in the same area, there's a kind of an indentation in the brain there. So you can see it's quite a sizable tumour. And that's post-operation on the right. And I think myself and my wife had expected when the tumour was taken out that the brain would somehow miraculously spring back. But apparently it doesn't. There's an indentation there for the rest of her life, which is just this extraordinary thing that's impacted so much on our life.
And I might bring in our experts now, maybe to kind of maybe go into a little bit more about kind of the science behind all this. And maybe Caroline, maybe you could talk us through that's the side of that area of the brain affects his speech. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that potentially.
Sure. So yes, I mean, the left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for, or largely responsible for, speech and language. And what Owen is describing in his wife sounds like, I've never met his wife, but sounds more like a disorder of language, which we call aphasia. So it's not so much about how the speech sounds or the pronunciation, but about the words and their meanings and how they're combined to create meaning. And most commonly, aphasia is a result of stroke. And obviously that's not the case with Owen's wife, and Mark is going to have a lot more to say on the nuances of that. But there are loads of different ways that people can present in terms of aphasia. They might have a lot more difficulty understanding language, and then production that sounds very fluent and you can hear the melody of the speech, but maybe it doesn't, maybe it's really difficult to understand what it means. Other people might have really good understanding, but have a lot of difficulty finding words or combining them. So it's really halting and difficult to get a message out at all. And for a lot of people with aphasia, and as I said, for most people that's post-stroke, they'll experience some recovery with speech and language therapy, but for most, they will live with some degree of aphasia as a chronic condition. So while we define it as a language disorder, the effect is really on communication, and Owen was talking about that earlier. So on this broader aspect of interacting in what we use words for, which is conversations and connection and relationships. And so, I mean, we may touch on this again, but a lovely quote that I really like from two aphasia researchers is that communication is the currency of life. So while this is starting in the brain and then manifesting in language, its true impact is in communication. So it affects functioning across relationships and life roles and activity. It affects inclusion, really, in terms of life. And so that's the piece that's been really interesting, that's really my interest, and that Owen and I have spent a lot of time discussing, is this life participation. And it's different with Owen's wife because it's sporadic, I guess, which it isn't for people who have it post-stroke, the people who I typically would work with.
And Mark, I might bring you in there now. If maybe you could give us some insights and about like the seizure kind of element of this. I'd love to hear a bit more about that, maybe.
Yeah, so I suppose maybe to start with, what is the definition of a seizure? So we've got 100 billion neurons in the adult human brain. We've probably got maybe over a trillion connections, or more than a trillion connections between those brain cells. So we've got this organ between our ears that it's the cells within it, the brain cells are densely interconnected with each other, and ultimately that's responsible for how we behave, how we communicate, how we take in the world. So any damage to that brain tissue can have a tremendous impact. And epilepsy or a seizure really is when you have these brain cells and rather than behaving in a normal way, they start to suddenly and excessively generate these sort of high frequency discharges. So brain cells communicate between each other. They can generate spikes, what we call spikes, which is an action potential. And then they communicate between each other using chemicals, neurochemicals that allow them to talk to each other. So, I mean, it's maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but one of the examples I used with Owen is that, we can kind of sometimes think of the brain in terms of epilepsy. In the normal state, the brain is like a seesaw. It's perfectly balanced. And then due to some kind of, external effect. So it could be, for example, a brain tumor. It could be traumatic brain injury. It could be an infection. What happens is that seesaw gets kind of tipped in one way. So on the seesaw, you have excitation and it's balanced out by inhibition. But if you get some sort of damage or some insult to the brain, what happens is that it gets skewed. And so the seesaw tips, and that's when you go into this state where you generate a seizure. Now, what's really interesting is that all of us, we are all capable of having a seizure at any time in our life. Most of us don't, because the normal mechanisms keep that seesaw in balance. And epilepsy is then when somebody has more, I think it's more than two unprovoked seizures, and that's when they're given a diagnosis of having epilepsy. And in the case of Owen's wife, seizure, epilepsy is a common symptom that's seen in patients that have brain tumors. So it can usually be part of the presentation. So somebody might have a unprovoked seizure, and then they go into hospital, they get a brain scan like the one we saw earlier, and when they look inside the brain, they see that there is something that shouldn't be there. So in the case of Owen's wife, I think Owen had mentioned that it was a meningioma. So our brain kind of has this membrane around it, which is called the meninges, and it's there to protect our brain. But what can happen is that sometimes a tumor can start to grow out of that meninges, and it's given the name of meningioma. So what happens then is that the membrane which covers the brain, the tumor actually starts to grow, and what it does is the tumor just wants more space. It just wants to grow. So it actually physically deforms the brain. So it applies pressure. And one of the things that we think is happening with the meningioma is that it's kind of just physically deforming the brain tissue until it gets to a point where, because of the sort of pressure on the brain, the stress, then you see the generation of a seizure. And that's in contrast, there's a different type of tumor which are called gliomas. Now they actually grow within the brain, and they are sort of more infiltrative. They actually are within the brain tissue itself. But again, seizures are a common presenting symptom in those types of tumors as well. And I think it's obviously, to be diagnosed with having a brain tumor is very significant and serious. But then I think additionally, to be sort of told because of that tumor you then have epilepsy, that's a sort of double whammy for a lot of these patients. And part of my research that I'm doing is really trying to understand the mechanisms of how tumor-associated epilepsy arises, and can we work out better ways of treating it.
And I know one of the things that you kind of you had a conversation with Owen about was about actually how you monitor seizures. And maybe we could share, I actually have a piece of audio that I can actually share now, but maybe we can talk about that a little bit. Is that? Yeah. So could you just tell us a little bit about that first, and then we can play the audio.
So as my title, so I'm professor of neurophysiology, and a lot of people kind of go, what does that mean? It means that I'm interested in how brain cells generate electrical activity, and how they do that in the physiological conditions, but also when things go wrong as well. And epilepsy is a great example as a disease of where we can study the changes that occur in terms of the ability of brain cells to generate electrical activity. So here we have, essentially a disorder of the cerebral cortex that involves kind of dysfunctional electrical communication. So what we do in my lab is we study brain tissue. We get live brain tissue, and we are able to study the brain cells and how they generate that electrical activity. So the recording that we're going to hear is a recording from it's a slice of tissue, brain tissue. We can keep the brain tissue alive in a dish, and that's a commonly used technique in my lab and in other labs as well. And then what we do is we stick little microelectrodes into the brain tissue, into the brain slice. And so what you're hearing is it's like the sort of ensemble activity that's being generated by tens of thousands of neurons. And essentially it's that activity that underlies the patterns that you would see in an EEG. So that's where you put electrodes on the scalp. So, our brains are constantly generating this kind of, sort of symphony of electrical activity. And most of the time it's normal, in brainwaves. So what you're going to hear is when it actually goes wrong and it generates a seizure-like event.
So I'll share my screen now, and we'll play that audio now. Oh, I can hear like a repetitious kind of frequency there.
So, I mean, that's a really good example of, in your introduction, you sort of talked about sort of classic sort of tonic-clonic convulsion that people, when they see somebody having, for example, what used to be called a grand mal type seizure. So you can actually hear that reflected in that electrical activity. So you get this very sort of excessive burst of activity at the start, and then it kind of goes into this more sort of like clonic-like pattern of activity. And so during that activity, we can monitor the behavior of individual brain cells and look at how they're behaving. And we use that in my lab to really sort of try and understand how we can then think about better ways of reducing that activity, or of course, what would ultimately be better is stopping that activity altogether.
Wow, that's unbelievable. I might bring in Caroline here for a second, actually. One of the things that you had with Owen was about a case study on for stroke patients. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and how that maybe tied into Owen's project.
Well, I mean, we spoke about, I should say first that the real hope was that we could involve an advisor with aphasia. So that's typically how I would engage, and in other contexts and in teaching contexts, collaborating and teaching alongside somebody who has expertise by experience. But the timing and the context with COVID really worked against us for that. But I think what was really reassuring is that Owen was bringing his own insights back to his wife and checking them with her as someone who has experiences of an unusual type of aphasia, but aphasia nonetheless. So we spoke about different people's experiences that I could report on. But one thing that's interesting is that Wernicke's aphasia has a lower incidence than other types of aphasia. Aphasia, it's about 5% of people who live with chronic aphasia, a little bit higher in the early stages of people who have post-stroke aphasia. So it's less well researched. But there is a man who very generously has shared his story online, been shared by an American group. And so we really used this gentleman's story, Byron, to look at that. And he has a video where he's on an aphasia cruise, which sounds wonderful with the aphasia recovery connection. And it really shows this melodic output, so as if, if we listen to somebody speaking perhaps a language that you don't speak, let's say Arabic, you can hear the communication in that speech, even though you're not understanding the words. And in a way, that's what was happening here. So we had a really interesting conversation about that with Owen, talking about this idea of using your peripheral hearing, which I think is a really important concept in engaging with people with aphasia. So moving the sense of responsibility for understanding in a conversation to the communication partner as well. So it's not just the language that's breaking down, but actually the person who's interacting with them has to use this idea of peripheral hearing to get some of this meaning out of what the person is saying that is being disrupted by either the seizure, in the case of Owen's wife, or the chronic neurological damage to that area in the case of people with post-stroke aphasia.
Wow. I'm sorry, it's like blow my mind. I was going to bring in Owen there. What has it been like for you to be interacting with the researchers here? In terms of tying in their work into your work. I remember before we talked about maybe bringing in talking about the speech, the cadence of the speech, kind of coming in, mixing in with the actual the seizure, kind of the repetition in the seizure audio. Maybe I know you're in the ideation stage of your kind of artwork at the moment. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more how you're kind of trying to tie these things together.
Yeah, well, it's been fantastic to work with Caroline and Mark. It's just you can see yourself there. You just sit back and just listen, and there's just so much information there, and so much fantastic information that just starts to ping with things you're thinking about. And talking about Byron there and how the rhythm of his speech and this kind of soft focus of listening in order to try and ascertain the communication of what he's trying to say was something that we connected with, I think. And I went back to my wife after that, and I got my wife Debbie after that conversation, and that Byron had when he was recorded having this conversation, talked to her about that, and how he had it all the time. And my wife said, "Well, inform me that she has it all the time, but it doesn't manifest profoundly. I suppose it's not. Maybe it's not at 100% or something, but she still gets it all the time. And so stuff like that has started to reveal itself in our life, I suppose I'd say. But also, it's the first time that I thought of it as a disability, to be honest. And my wife can't work anymore or anything like that. But it's the first time the terminology around disability started to click with me or whatever. But obviously in a negative way, but not in a totally kind of disempowering way, I suppose. And it's a way of finding a way through that, I suppose. But working with the Mark and Caroline has been absolutely fantastic. And I think the two bits that we've talked about there, so there's the recording of the brain going through a seizure. The rhythm of that is just absolutely astonishing. And I can see myself using that. Like I can, at the moment, as you're saying, I'm in this ideas phase. So it's just about gathering information and gathering lots of ideas and see what works together. So I think there could be some sort of, the way those two things are kind of leading me at the moment is through something to do with rhythm or something to do with a cadence or, and I can imagine a kind of a space where the noise of that played through really powerful speakers can actually almost hit you in the chest, that you can actually feel it physically. Like if you get the right sound system, that could, as a person coming in to experience something, that you could actually physically feel that. And I think linking that in with that kind of the rhythm of, say, we talked about Byron, the rhythm of his speech or somebody like that, like some sort of link with rhythm there is where I'm kind of settling now, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it's still really, really early days.
That's kind of the next stage of your exploration is kind of going down potentially that avenue.
Yeah, absolutely. Along with other things, like there's other things that
just at the moment, that's something that spikes.
Like the week before, I heard the recording of the seizure. It was something else. It was kind of almost like an historic kind of avenue of looking at the history of epilepsy and things like that, you know.
I know, just talking about history there, I know one of the more unusual tangents I think Mark kind of pointed you down was potentially about something to do with historic texts and religious texts. I don't know if you can maybe share a little bit about that.
Yeah, like he gave me a book, a title of a book, Smell of Burning, which is by a guy called Colin Grant, and it's a really interesting book, and it's really kind of anecdotally written. He writes about his younger brother, who suffered with epilepsy all his life, but in each of the incidents he will go into the kind of the history of that particular theme that he's looking at that moment. So it might be the medication that's being used, or it might be how people with epilepsy were seen in society. So so that's been really interesting, and like there's stuff in that, like the idea around epilepsy colonies that sprung up in kind of 19th century, and places of kind of refuge for people that suffer with epilepsy. And then during that time you get this the rise of eugenics as well, so you get to see people kind of looking at how eugenics can influence a society to think that people are lesser than other people, I suppose, and that all these people are kept in colonies, and they would have been they were in these colonies, and this idea of eugenics growing at the same time ends up kind of undermining the initial idea of these safe refuges of colonies. And that was really interesting to me. But also, Mark put me onto this idea of the conversion of St. Paul on the road to Damascus, and that may have been some sort of epileptic seizure that made him convert to Christianity. So these avenues of exploration.
I never would have thought of that in a million years.
I might jump in there and just
absolutely.
We finished a really interesting project on 8 centuries of communication disability last year. And we had an exhibition in the Long Room, which is part of it available online through the library. And some of those similar kind of themes come up. And I'd be interested to go back and look actually now, Mark and Owen, with that in mind, for some of the quick cures where people got better from waters in Bath in the UK was one example. And just
there's a really interesting history to a lot of this. I mean, epilepsy as a neurological condition has probably been around with us, for forever. I mean, there's you can go to the British Library and there's a tablet. So it's a Neo-Babylonian tablet from a sort of diagnostic handbook from a medical diagnostic series. So these are called sort of Akkadian medical texts, and in this tablet, it sort of gives the symptoms of epilepsy and assigns disease names to the various ways that the symptoms kind of present themselves. So there's like several terms for fit or seizure. So that's right back in Babylonian times. And then moving forward, we see mentions of epilepsy. So there's obviously references in the Bible. There's a number of famous people throughout history who, again, we believe probably had epilepsy. So ranging from people like Joan of Arc to Dostoevsky, the Russian writer. And again, I think that for a long time there was a huge degree of stigma associated with epilepsy, and probably still in some parts of the world there is stigma associated with it. But also, that then sort of was reflected in some of the treatments that were used for epilepsy. So again, some of the treatments were sort of quite barbaric. So, just to give you an example, they ranged from exorcism to, in Roman times, it was sucking the blood from a fallen gladiator, right through to,
God.
right
shocking.
Through to, drilling or burning holes in the skull of somebody suffering from epilepsy, and actually even castration in some cases. So I think we're at the history is always really important for this, because it gives us a context of where to kind of position ourselves and clearly see the advances that we've made. And again, just on that note, even if you look at Wernicke in terms of his description of aphasia, I think the original paper that he published, it was 10 patients, but actually it was probably only one patient, and that was a 70-year-old woman who had severe comprehension deficits, and people actually thought that was because she was deaf. And it was only when that lady died and they did a post-mortem on her brain that they found, her brain was relatively normal apart from one focal lesion in the superior temporal gyrus, and that's where we now believe Wernicke's area is located in the left-hand side of the brain, as Caroline had mentioned earlier on. So again, the history of science, the history of medicine, I find it really interesting, because I think it also acts as a really useful interface between C.P. Snow talked about the two cultures, science and humanities, and I think the history of all of this kind of acts as a really interesting interface to bring sort of
all together.
These things all together.
Perhaps we can share the link to this, because we have, for example, in terms of treatment, we had an interesting doctor in Limerick who we found in the archives, who divided his book up into people who were cured, people who were partly cured, and people who weren't cured. And he does have a case study there of somebody having a head injury and presenting with aphasia-like symptoms. And the conclusion is that this doctor in Limerick writes is that he died, he bled him from the jugular, and he died despite the treatment, unfortunately.
Oh my God.
Shouldn't laugh.
But he had.
I know, yeah, I'm literally, yeah, sorry. Oh God, like.
Poor man. But you
Oh
get
my
that,
God.
like any, like that book, The Smell of Burning, you get that it's peppered with those kinds of stories. Just horrific kind of, like, I have to pick my job off the ground, going, like, I'm never letting a doctor do anything to me. Like, just
We've come further than that.
Yeah, definitely.
I might jump in there. I say, just before we wrap up this conversation, I might go around and say, like, maybe each could maybe talk about maybe what they've gotten from this, what they've learned from this process. I know, Owen, it's the first time you kind of linked in with like the sciences and vice versa. So maybe we'll start with Mark. Maybe you could tell us maybe how this process has been for you as an advisor.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's been great. I mean, I really have enjoyed my interactions with Owen, and you know, I suppose initially I was throwing a lot of information at him, so I was like, read this, read that. And you know, it was great because I think, you know, I hope he enjoyed me firing all of this information at him. But I think it was really useful. I mean, I always enjoy these types of interactions because I think as a scientist, you know, we have a responsibility to engage with other disciplines. And, you know, I think particularly in the time that we find ourselves in at the minute, there needs to be a higher degree of interaction between people from a scientific background and people from a humanities background. It's a really important space because I think it then leads to a better informed public about the value of science and why science is important. Because I think if you don't have that, you then create a void, and that's where, you know, you get a lot of the kind of weird, wacky conspiracy theory stuff, you know, sort of filling in. So, you know, I think it's been really important, and I think as a scientist, I found it really enjoyable because it sort of gets me to think about how I communicate what I do in the lab, which, you know, as you've seen and listened to, you know, it's quite stimulating. So, you know, there's the auditory component. I mean, one of the things we're hoping to do maybe next week or the week after is get Owen into the lab.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
You know, again, there's a big visual part to what we do, because when we record these neurons, we're watching it on a screen, you know, we're recording the activity. So again, it's about, you know, a process of engagement and a process of communication that leads to, again, a better informed general public, which I think is really important.
All for the better. And Caroline, maybe bring it on to you maybe next. What have you gotten out of this experience?
I think some of what Mark is saying as well, the conversations were just excellent conversations. They were enjoyable. And you know, this is the first time that I'm in a conversation with Mark as well as Owen, but I really liked the idea that we were spanning this scientific and social sciences divide in a way, from these individual neurons and these neural networks all the way up to what this means for inclusion in a conversation and the linguistic basis of the conversation and the social impact and the societal role for that. But I suppose for me, it was really about the conversations. And I think it just reinforced my bias that conversations are so critical.
Yeah.
You know, the conversation itself, the conversation about conversation was so important that, you know, even witnessing Owen's process, sort of a natural, unscripted, unplanned journey of creative output, was exactly like conversation, unscripted, improvised, you know, and really makes you reflect on the impact when that doesn't go as smoothly as we are used to, as we take for granted. So yeah, it's been really interesting, and we'll need to follow up on a conversation about the role of rhythm in intervention, Owen, given the rhythm discussions.
And lastly, Owen, maybe like your final thoughts.
Yeah, it's been fantastic so far, and like, this is, for me, is just the start of it, and I've never collaborated with scientists or anybody in the sciences really in this way, I suppose. So normally we kind of at Anew, we're normally collaborating with kind of vast different types of people. So it'll be people from museums, archivists, historians, doctors. It can be anything, but this is the first time that we've kind of engaged within the science world, I suppose, and the Science Gallery has opened up those doors too. And I wouldn't have found it as easily, I think, except for the rapid residencies coming up. And it's been brilliant to talk to Mark and Caroline and just to kind of to start that journey, I think. And even from this conversation here now, it's starting to make links between those two worlds, and it's starting to kind of ping and things are starting to go off again. And I'm really looking forward to where it's going to end up.
Brilliant. No, I'm sure we all can't wait to see what comes about of this. And also, we'll finish our conversation maybe on that positive note. But I'd like to say thanks very much to everyone that's been on the interviews today. I think we've had some great, some amazing, curious conversations to tie in with the Festival of Curiosity, of course. So I just want to say thanks very much to Mark, Owen and Caroline, and also to Aideen, Beulah and Giselle. That's it. Thanks so much to everyone at home. I'm sure your cup of tea that you had at the start might be finished by now, so put on the kettle and get ready to have that again. But thanks so much, everyone, and stay tuned to the Science Gallery website, Instagram and other social media platforms for news and events that are coming up in Science Gallery. Thanks so much, everyone. See you soon.